1.76 million. The US has more prisoners than any other nation. The history of prisons is scarred with a lack of basic human decency. Not even 100 years ago, many thought of a prison sentence as a near-death sentence. Yet, many Americans remain blissfully unaware of perhaps one of the greatest human rights movements in American history, the fight for prison healthcare. Over the course of the early to middle 20th century, as prison populations began growing faster than ever, healthcare for prisoners was in steep decline. More and more prisoners were dying each year, and the outside public didn't seem to care. That would all change in 1979, after a decade of culminating prisoner rights protests, when a single man filed a lawsuit against the governor of Colorado, claiming his lack of basic healthcare was cruel and unusual punishment. This man, Fidel Ramos, and his case, Ramos v. Lamb, soon became a turning point in history for the tide of prison healthcare, turning the grim realities of prisons in the 50s and 60s into the massive privatized prison healthcare industry today. Up until the 1970s, prisons had few regulations. Prisoners were often dangerously mistreated and had no legal avenue to challenge the oppressive system in which they were caged. Much like their contemporaries in other states, prisons in Colorado had infamously high death rates and poor sanitation systems. And as prison populations skyrocketed in the 1950s and 60s, the few doctors in prisons were stretched dangerously thin. Many doctors were incentivized to hold short appointments with prisoners, often leading to misdiagnosis or blatant malpractices. Prisoners had to wait weeks or months for life-saving treatment, and often would be rushed in and out of the hospital in order to save money. The 1970s witnessed the first rise of inmate reform. The nation sharply began to learn about the abysmal state of prisons following the 1971 Attica prison riot, where over 1,000 prisoners rose up against the prison guards in protest for their lack of basic human rights. 33 prisoners died in the riot, leading to the first time the prison rights movement had ever made national headlines. Yet, Attica prison was only the start. Between 1970 and 1978, inmate lawsuits jumped by 300% as thousands of prisoners realized they deserved more. Very few of these lawsuits stuck. The courts were hesitant, and not a single case had made an outstanding impact. That was until the turning point of Fidel Ramos. Ramos was incarcerated in 1974 and was quickly lost into the system. He had been sentenced to 24 years in prison for a bank robbery. As a young 27-year-old with a passion for law, Ramos could always be found in the prison library poring through books about law. Yet, while his time in prison began as just uncomfortable, it worsened quickly as he was plagued by constant health problems. His prison cell was small and damp, and the prison disease-ridden. Ramos quickly realized, as had many of his fellow inmates, that he deserved more. Ramos had a vision for prisons. He wanted to see his fellow inmates treated with basic human decency in hospitals. The opportunity arose in 1979 when Fidel Ramos, who was feeling pain and required a healthcare checkup, was denied access to the hospital. This illustration of the injustices in the prison healthcare system gave Ramos just enough of a springboard to launch his lawsuit. Ramos, who was an aspiring lawyer, initially filed his case against the state of Colorado as pro se, meaning that he would represent himself. However, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Colorado Coalition of Legal Services, and the National Prison Project quickly learned of Ramos's case and formed a comprehensive legal team. This case, they figured, might be their very first breakthrough into the veiled world of prison healthcare. Thus, later that year, Fidel Ramos sued the governor of Colorado for poor healthcare treatment in the prison where he was locked up, Colorado's oldest prison, Old Max. At the time, his case seemed trivial, drowned in a nationwide wave of prison healthcare reform cases, and there seemed to be little chance that he could win. Yet, the case soon proved itself to be just the victory prisoners across the nation needed. Ramos's first case, filed in 1979 and presented to the court in 1980, sued Governor Richard Lamb by challenging conditions of confinement at the maximum security unit of the Colorado State Penitentiary at Canyon City, Colorado. Fidel Ramos sued the governor under the guise of a violation of the 8th Amendment, which prohibited cruel and unusual punishment. He claimed that the lack of healthcare treatment in Old Max and the overall abysmal conditions couldn't stand under the 8th Amendment.
People would literally be stuck in their cells for 24 hours a day, sometimes only let out for very short periods of time, with human waste covering the floor. It was a god-awful kind of place to be.
The case barreled ahead at an unprecedented speed. Swamped with other cases, the governor's lawyers, who represented the state of Colorado, struggled to deal with Ramos's lawsuit. The night before the trial date, Governor Richard Lamb himself sent a personal letter to the judge attempting to postpone the case. The judge agreed. Yet, even with the extra time, Ramos seemed to have the clear upper hand. A flurry of speeches and testimonies later, the judge made his final ruling. While not much is known of the actual trial due to incomplete records, appellate court summaries clearly outlined the case as a struggle between Ramos and the entire Colorado prison healthcare system, with Ramos coming out more than victorious. Following extensive discovery and a 5-week trial, the district court ruled that the conditions at the facility deprived the prisoners of constitutional rights. The judge had sided with Ramos on almost every account, splintering the Colorado Department of Corrections system and requiring multiple immediate changes. The district court held the following conditions at the prison to be unconstitutional. 1. An inadequate physical environment because of lack of sanitation, heat, ventilation, lighting, and plumbing. 2. Lack of prisoner safety because of the physical layout of the prison and inadequate staff supervision. 3. Idleness and lack of exercise. 4. Inadequate medical attention. 5. An arbitrary classification system. 6. Overly broad visitation restrictions. 7. Excessive restrictions on correspondence. And 8. Insufficient access to the courts because the law library was inadequate and insufficient time was permitted for library use. Every single one of these issues was to be immediately fixed, and the old Max prison was to be shut down permanently unless its entire sanitation and healthcare systems were redone. While the case continued for the next 10 years as the state attempted to overturn the ruling in any way possible, the judge's original ruling stuck. Fidel Ramos had won. Ramos's case had begun a cascade of other lawsuits, each winning a new victory for prisoner rights. Fidel Ramos had, without a doubt, created a permanent turning point for the rights of prisoners. The floodgates had been opened to a storm of cases that would restructure the prison healthcare system across the nation forever. Fidel Ramos's name spread swiftly across prisons nationwide. By 1983, the Ramos v. Lamb case had already made a pivotal impact on judges' decisions in prison cases across multiple states. In Wellman v. Faulkner, Bruce D. Wellman sued the head of state of Indiana's prison system, Gordon H. Faulkner, in order to challenge the adequacy of Michigan City's medical care. Wellman cited Fidel Ramos. With respect to medical care, plaintiffs can establish an Eighth Amendment violation, proving that there are such systemic and gross deficiencies in staffing, facilities, equipment, or procedures that the inmate population is effectively denied access to adequate medical care. Ramos v. Lamb. The official ruling on the case found that, in fact, the Indiana State Prison had violated Wellman's rights as a prisoner under the Eighth Amendment. The Michigan City prison healthcare system was forced to completely restructure. Within 5 years of the case being decided, hundreds of cases had already cited the decision, including United States v. Sharp, French v. Owens, Garcia v. Salt Lake County, Lindquist v. Idaho State Board of Corrections, and Anderson v. City of Atlanta, affecting dozens of states. To this day, the Ramos v. Lamb case has been cited in over 1,800 prison healthcare cases nationwide, completely upending the stagnant prison healthcare system that had oppressed many for so long. Of course, the fight for prisoners' rights isn't over. Today across the nation, protests have been sprouting in almost every major city about prisons. After decades of struggle, Americans are demanding a fairer system of incarceration. But, at the very least, Fidel Ramos's case put the nation on the right track, creating the most significant turning point in the history of prison healthcare in the United States.
You know, he refused to be dehumanized. He really stood on the fact that he had certain rights as a human being.
Though Ramos passed away in 2010, he lives on through the determination and courage that was evident in his years of legal work fighting for the rights of prisoners. His legacy lives on.